request, and now we are in the incredibly unfortunate position, I said unfortunate, the incredibly fortunate position of being full-time content creators, but more specifically and most importantly for this panel, gamers. We sure do like the old board games. And this is the part where I'm going to start reading off my screen because I get really nervous, so I always need notes. But so as neurodivergent advocates and disability educators, our position is a unique one in that our disabilities and our neurodivergencies have become really part of the narrative surrounding our work. And we've become really passionate about making the gaming community more accessible as a whole. Did it? Nope.
We've learned.
It's gonna continue to just be like super funny. Okay. Slide 1. In your head, oh, look at it!
All right. This is the first one we've had to have a slideshow for. So I want you to think of a question for you, my friends. I want you to think of your favorite game, some game that you like to play. Catan, D&D. What's the one that everybody hates?
I don't know.
There's one that everybody hates that I meant to look up before the show. No, I want you to perhaps, yeah. I want you to imagine that you had a friend who had a physical disability and how you might accommodate them playing that game. Now I want you to imagine that you had a friend who had a mental disability, a developmental disorder. How would you help them? It's a bit more complicated when it's not something that you can see and immediately understand. It gets a little bit more tricky and it becomes more difficult to develop good intentions in gaming and turn those into good outcomes in gaming. So we're here to sort of help with that, I suppose.
Slide 2.
Oh yeah.
This is gonna continue to just be the bit for the whole thing.
Oh, I didn't take down the stock photo.
It's okay.
It's an old picture.
Stock photos. Thanks, Canva.com. So in the disability community, there is a saying, nothing about us without us, to keep disabled people in the conversation surrounding disability. And as professional gamers and content creators and mental health educators and advocates, what we have found is that often the conversation about gaming and accessibility and inclusivity happens around us, right? There's this like theory that's like, oh, our game is so accessible because we use large print, or oh, like one time we asked a colorblind dude if he could read the cards and he said yes, accessible. And it's not so much that, right? There is this broad sense of we should cater to the disabled and neurodivergent community, but the challenge is that the disability community is not a monolith.
Yeah, I like the saying, if you've met one ADHD person, you've met one ADHD person. They're not all the same.
Precisely. And what works for you might not work for me, and that's okay.
That's me.
Just the quality and just the little cartoons. You're welcome. It's great.
It's late and stay up
All night. So you go.
So what I was going to say, something we do hear a lot is that somebody will know an ADHD person or an autistic person, and they'll know what that one person really likes, and they're confused when that strategy doesn't work with other people. And it's an understandable confusion because, again, developmental disorders, the invisible disorders, are not something you can just immediately see and sort of get a grasp of. So I think that's really important to bring up before we start the panel.
Yeah, so like we just said, what works for one person might not work for you, and that is okay. And so in conversation with things like, captions, in video games, or, large print game cards, that kind of thing, that's often what gets promoted as adaptive and inclusive, but when honestly, that's kind of the bare minimum, right? And so that's what we want to get past today, is the bare minimum. So, oh man, my notes. It's so good, we got it. So today's panel is going to be split into 2 different sections. We're going to talk a little bit about basic strategies, and then we're going to open the floor to questions and throw around some more specific ideas. And I'm being informed that we do have to end with uproarious applause.
It's actually, yeah, it's 3 seconds. 3 sections, uproarious applause happens at the end. Yep. So we're incredibly fortunate to be able to talk about this kind of thing for a living. And we get approached with the narrative of, well, our game isn't supposed to be for everybody. And that's, well, do you want to take this one, actually?
Sure. So when we tour the country a lot, like Eric just said, one of the things that we face the most is that we talk with a lot of game designers and a lot of developers, and they say, well, my game isn't supposed to be for everybody. It's supposed to be for this specific segment of people, or this specific, segment of people, and that kind of thing. And frankly, we're not here to combat that idea, right? Like, it is totally your right to make a game that is purely based on pattern matching or storytelling or the living hellscape that is Settlers of Catan. But what we are here, there's like one person in the back, like, I see you, thank you. But what we are here to combat is the idea that excluding an audience based on cognitive or physical disability, that's a very different thing than like preferring Pathfinder to Dungeons and Dragons, right? Your game might not be for me, and that is okay, but I want to be able to decide if it sucks or not for myself. And that comes with considerations of adaptability and inclusivity. Thank you.
We also sort of need to unpack our biases around the actual word disability. It's a word that many people are very hesitant to use. Accessibility. Sorry. But it's important to unpack our biases about the word disability, because it's something that often comes with a lot of negative connotations. It's a term that a lot of people are very hesitant to use because of the ideas that sort of surround the idea. But it's frankly a label that a lot of people wear with pride. It's just part of who they are, and it helps them communicate their experience to other people. I just got these glasses and I'm not used to the fog. It's really common, and I think people are nervous generally. They're nervous that they're going to say a wrong thing or do a bad thing surrounding a disability, and that can really shut down conversation about these topics that I think are really important conversations to have. And we need to sort of forgive ourselves for asking fumbly questions, and we need to forgive ourselves for messing up and have patience with each other as we learn how to navigate each other's brains.
Yeah, communication can be imperfect. And that's something to keep in mind, because often when we have conversations about inclusivity and adaptability, there's this idea that there's like this perfect question that you ask, and you ask it in this perfectly nuanced way, and then the person you're asking gives you like a lifetime movie speech about whatever, and then hooray, you've, cured disability forever. And that's not how it works. Communication is often very clunky. Asking the right questions, fumbling towards finding the right questions is a totally normal and valid part of the process. And the real truth is that sometimes you're going to make mistakes. We are disability advocates, and we often make mistakes, and it happens. And mistakes and stumbles are all part of the process of growth and considering these things and really, I think, changing the gaming community for the better, because messing up can be an incredible opportunity to learn and discover and find your weaknesses and find your failings and find those parts that are also really awesome and that you don't really have trouble with. And I think that is really important in consideration with the community that you're trying to serve.
Yeah, I think a big part of that is maintaining patience and maintaining coming from a place of compassion is extremely important for that, because a lot of times we're afraid that other people are going to negatively react when we admit we don't know something. But guess what? We don't know most things. And admitting that is a very good thing to do, if scary at times. Now we're going to throw around the term neurodivergent a lot. What? Neurodivergent is a term that, Jesus, these are echoing. Neurodivergent is a term that basically describes anybody whose brain works outside of what is considered normal.
But what is normal? We can have that argument another day.
That's more of like an entire life's worth of conversations to figure out what the hell that means. But neurodivergent basically describes anybody whose brain operates outside of what is considered normal. If a normal 3-year-old can do a certain level on a certain task, somebody who does far better or far worse, that would be considered divergent. It doesn't mean bad, it just means different. So this includes ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, aphasia. It's a very big umbrella term, but basically it means somebody who might have different mental needs than a normal person. Heavy asterisk on the normal person.
And it's also important to note that some people do use neurodivergency as a broader term to encompass things like mental illness and intellectual disabilities as well, but the community remains somewhat in debate, so that's why we like to use the terms disability and neurodivergency, because we feel that those are the labels that sort of like encompass the most members of the community without necessarily commenting on those labels.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier I said, the disabled and the neurodivergent community it's so small.
It's gonna be a list, Claire.
It's okay. So 15% of the world's population is disabled in some way. And what that looks like can vary vastly from person to person. Many people have more than one disability, and they can combine in ways that make navigating, something as seemingly simple as sitting down to play a board game with your friends pretty challenging. For me personally, I always tell this because I feel like it really contextualizes things. I have ADHD. I also have treatment-resistant depression, and I also have a separate neurological condition called myoclonic dystonia, which is a disorder characterized by sudden, uncontrollable muscle spasms. So if you see me look suddenly to the right, nothing's happening, I'm fine. But it does mean that I live with chronic pain, and it also means that sometimes my hands don't work, which makes it really interesting to be a gamer who suddenly sometimes loses the ability to use their hands. It can make life a little bit more challenging. So, Eric, transition to you. We have them marked, but we keep forgetting to do the significant eye contact.
Well, it's also really funny. I have a really hard time reading. My ADHD makes it very difficult for me to read, and this is one of the first times we've actually done text-based notes. So we're learning.
Learning as we go.
But it is important, again, to remember, of course, that one size does not fit all. You cannot just do a couple of things like add captions or make your cards bigger, and then all of a sudden, oh, I have the most accessible game in the entire world. Where's my statue? I thought that was really funny. So you would have to think about, first off, does your game involve a lot of physical things? Does it involve small pieces that need to be manipulated? Because that is obviously something that might affect somebody with a physical disability. So similarly, you might think of, does my game involve really small text? As much as I think having large text on cards is sort of an easy joke to make, is like the bare minimum, that can also be extremely important.
So there's great ways to very quickly and easily make your game more accessible, right? But every game in existence has different methodologies, right? So it's less about figuring out how to make your game more accessible to every single possible combination of disability and neurodivergency. It's really about trying to maximize accessibility for the group that you're trying to design for, right? Like Twister isn't going to be a game that perhaps somebody with a physical disability is raring to play, but the same way that a pattern matching game wouldn't be great with people for people with visual accessibility needs, right? That makes sense. So it's not about saying everybody's game has to be accessible for everybody, but what it is saying is that it's about being conscious of the inaccessibilities, even if practicality means that you can't do much about it, without changing your game into something different. It's about considering it. It's about the effort that you put in. Does that kind of make sense a little bit? And so we hope that we really want you to take away some key ideas and ways to make your games more accessible, but our goal is really and truly not to slap a one-size-fits-all solution onto every game. Rather, what we want to do is give you some tools and some strategies to consider as you have conversations about and around accessibility as you move forward from here. And it's also, I just want to be very clear, we always have mixed audiences at these things, right? Sometimes we have game developers, show of hands, anybody making games out here? Anybody playing games out here? Significantly more hands, right? And so the thing to keep in mind is that we sort of present this panel as for game developers. But what this really is an opportunity for, even if you're at home, you can adapt games that you love to play at home. You can house rule them all to heck, You can do the things that you need, but if you know somebody with a disability or neurodivergence, this is a really great way to say, hey, I'm gonna look for games that might be better or worse for us to play together. I'm gonna keep an eye out for those things, and I'm gonna make my table and my home and my gaming practices more inclusive and adaptable for everybody. So if you're sitting here going, but I only play board games, this isn't for me, this absolutely still is for you. And the fact that you are here and part of this conversation is so important, because what you are doing is you are showing up and you're saying that these conversations are necessary in the community. So thanks for being here. Appreciate that.
Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause.
Yeah, clapping.
I've always wanted to say that. Now, we are content creators, and so we are obligated to turn this into some sort of clickbait. So,
the top 10 questions to ask. They were supposed to appear one at a time, so just close your eyes when we get to number 2, okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the first thing to consider in your game or your hypothetical game is how much stuff is there in the box? Discuss.
Well, for me, I mean, what's the game? Betrayal at House on the Hill. Fantastic game. Did I say the title right?
Yes.
I think this is the first time I've ever actually gotten the title right. Fantastic game, but there are so many little coins and little pieces and little things that need to go in specific places. I love the game when I go and it's organized and we can play, but I never play the game because I'm so terrified of dropping a thing and then it's gone forever, or like putting a thing in the wrong thing and then we lost the ghoul chip that indicates that there's a ghoul behind the corner. So considering stuff like that, not only for the sake of people with physical disabilities, but when there's a plethora of just stuff to be considered at all times, for somebody with ADHD, that can be immensely difficult to hold all those concepts in our head at the same time. We have very poor working memories. The desktop of our brain is just opening and closing files all the time. So considering that, you might perhaps have a bunch of optional parts of the game, where if you want it to be more complex, you can add this. Or if you want it to be very simple, you can just do the very simple version of those things. So considering how much physical stuff there is, but also how many components need to be held in your brain at the same time at all times, is a very necessary thing to think about. Again, you can handle it however you feel fit, but considering that is very important.
Absolutely. So speaking of complexity, number 2. How complex are the rules? And this is the asterisk. Do they have to be? Does your game have to be? Like one guy in the back. Thank you. Does it have to be? Oftentimes, new game designers, and as somebody who has in fact designed a game myself, it is a story for another day, but oh boy. Oftentimes there's this idea that like, I'm gonna make the most challenging and complex, like there will never have been a game this complex and it's like, why? What does it add to the play experience, you know? If you can do something in 6 rounds of play, why does it have to be 15? If you can, you know, have a card or a cheat sheet or something that allows your players, you know, to sort of like keep track of what is going on, why not include those? Maybe not every person who opens your game box uses those, but thinking about the complexity of your game, how can I pare this down to the bare minimum in order to give my players the fullest experience? That can be really helpful. That's also one that is really, really useful in consideration of like your home table, right? So if you have, you know, a game that you love to play, but it's very complex, maybe there's an easier version of it that you can, you know, develop or work through with your players in order to make everybody just a little bit more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Well, the next one is, what does my game look like? And we do mean that in a lot of ways literally. What does my game literally look like? I think, when I think about this particular question, I think of it as a way that you can make your game more accessible without making it worse. I think a lot of times when people think about making a game accessible, they think about sacrifice. They think about, what do I have to sacrifice to make this more accessible? What do I have to make worse about my game to make it more accessible? When that's just really a false dichotomy. A game I think of is Boss Monster, one of my favorite games. Boss Monster is a dungeon building game. There are a bunch of room cards, and there are 2 types of rooms, monster rooms and trap rooms, and they're different freaking colors. Not on the back, but on the front, they're different colors. So me, when I have all these cards in my hand, and I'm trying to figure out what I have, I can just go gray, gray, red, 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 gray, gray, gray. They didn't have to do that. They didn't have to do that at all. And it doesn't remove anything from the game by doing it, but they considered it. And that's really important, even just the consideration. So anytime you can put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's looking at this who might have trouble processing visual stimulus. Do you have a bunch of completely unrelated neon colors? Do the other colors arbitrary? That's one of my favorite things, is when things are different colors, but the colors don't mean anything. It's like, God, why would you do this? So those are all things to consider when you're thinking about what your game physically looks like. If things are different colors, maybe the colors mean something. In fact, please make them mean something, otherwise don't make them different colors, please. But all those things can help make things more accessible for people who have trouble processing things visually as well.
Yeah, and in addition to that, what my game looks like also includes sort of the component parts. It's not just about the cards, it's not just about the board. It can be about the instructions or the UI if you're talking more like video games. Are you using fonts that are accessible? Do you have like, you know, like a really like gothic English font for your vampire game, or do you have something that is going to be really easy for somebody with perhaps dyslexia to process and play with? How large are your instruction manuals? Do you have like a little itty bitty thing? Do you have magazine size somewhere in the middle? Does it fold? Does it unfold? What is the actual functionality of the piece of paper in your hand? The thing that I get really excited about when we always do this panel is that there's so much. Like, you sort of start pulling at the thread, right? You start at fonts, and then you unravel that a little bit, and then you get to like the size, and then you get to the folding, and then you get to like, okay, but is there like a YouTube video or something? Like, it can get as large as you want the conversation to be, and it also can be as small as you need it to be. And so we sort of rapid fire this because we both have ADHD and we just like to info dump on everybody. But we want to make sure that we're very clear when we say that like small steps can be just as powerful, right? If you only do one of these things, if you only consider two of these things, if you ask your big fancy game developer boss, like, hey, can we just look at the color palette? That is still a monumental step towards accessibility in a way that, somebody at your company might never have done before. And that can be really, really popular, or powerful, I mean.
And contagious.
And contagious, yeah. Precisely.
The next one is a big one for us, is how long is a single round of play? What a long round of play is for one person might be very different for another person. What a long D&D game might be for one person could be a very short one for somebody else. So how long is one individual round of play? Something that really bothers me about games is when I take my turn and then it's another 20 minutes until I get to do anything again, which is fine. There's nothing objectively wrong with that. But if you're considering, are ADHD people going to enjoy this game? Are people who have sensory processing disorder going to enjoy this game? Are they going to be able to remember what they're doing during the 20 minutes of downtime they have between their turns? Those are all things, again, to consider. And I also want to stress on this point, you can do whatever you want. You can go, they're going to be 20 minutes and that's just the way it is. But you should think about that. Similarly, if you're not a game designer and you're a game player, think of ways that you can shorten rounds. Where it's like, you can put a timer on something if you want. Once you buy the game, guess what? It's your game. You can do whatever you want. You can play with 3 queens in a chess game if you wanted to. You can modify the games yourself to make rounds of combat shorter. That really helps. That has saved games for me, where it's supposed to be played in this massive, huge, large-scale way, but we've turned it into like a speed, what is it, a talisman. We turned it into like a speed game. It's like, all right, you get 1 minute for your turn. You have to do as much as possible in the turn, and now I love that game. So remember that, as if you're a game designer, it's important to consider these things. If you're a game player, remember that you can change whatever you want. You can just Sharpie the thing if you want, write new rules. You have agency about this too. And
similarly, just the real question of how long does the game last? A 6-hour game of D&D is very different than a 1-hour game of D&D, you know what I mean? And so just thinking about like round length, round speed, that kind of thing, but then also like, what are my players getting themselves into? Is this a 1-hour time commitment or a 6-hour time commitment? Looking at you, Game of Thrones board game. That game ruins lives. So the next one is, does my game involve communication or visualization? This one is very sort of near and dear to my neurodivergent heart because a lot of neurodivergent people struggle with communication in one way or another. And many games, and many really fabulous games, are built on improv or storytelling or collectively building a world together. And that can be really challenging for somebody with communication challenges or difficulties. The same way that visualization can be really challenging for the neurodivergent. Personally, I have aphantasia, which means that if you ask me to picture an apple, I cannot do it. I have the idea of what an apple is, but I cannot picture an apple in my mind. And that comes up frequently in gaming. There's a lot of gaming that involve, a lot of even like video games and stuff that involve visualization and spatial reasoning. And that can be really frustrating for a player. For me personally, I play a lot of like D&D charity streams on Twitch, and a lot of the DMs that I've worked with have a really bad habit of saying, okay, you find yourself in a Viking hall and your player is 3 feet to the right of the wall. And I'm like, I have no idea where I am in space. I have no idea what's going on. I cannot picture this. It's all gray. Please help. And so being cognizant of that, finding ways like, can you insert art into your game? Can you have art cards, or do you have a website where you can generate, different images, different pictures, that kind of stuff that can be really, really useful.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I'll get there eventually. Another thing that I personally struggle with a lot is memory. Again, I have ADHD. We struggle with working memory. Again, the desktop of our brain is just popping up things and closing things all the time. So a fair amount of games involve memorizing stuff, even for short periods of time. And that's fine, but that's another thing to be aware of. Is if your game involves memory, are we talking you have to memorize 10 things? Is it like Simon Says, where you have to continually, or what, not Simon, you know what I'm talking about, the beep boop box.
A bop it?
Oh, I guess a bop it would be the same thing. Is it a continually compiling group of memorization things? There's nothing wrong with having memorization in your game, but if you do, you might want to consider that. Perhaps develop an alternate way of playing where, okay, you can do the memory game and involve memory in the game, or you can just do away with that entirely and just write it down. And if that's not in the actual game itself, once you buy the game, again, it's yours. You can play however you want. This panel, again, absolutely is as much for players of games as it is designer for games. You have agency to change the rules of the games if you want. So games that involve a lot of memory, perhaps develop a workaround. That might help, or an alternate way of gameplay that still furthers the game, but relies less heavily on working memory. That can be very helpful.
And similarly, I guess along that same vein, I should say, is how do players learn how to play the game? Is that a process that is based in memory? Are there quick reference sheets? Do they have to read, like a 200-page instruction manual? How is that information laid out? Are there cheat sheets? Are there here's how to get started, your quick start guide? Are there video components, right? For somebody who struggles with reading, is there a way that they can learn without ever picking up the instruction manual? YouTube is a great resource for this. Because any company in the world, if you have a Gmail account, you can have a YouTube channel. Even if you were a small indie game designer, and having a playthrough or having here's how to set up the board where it's a 2-minute video instead of a 25-page instruction manual, as somebody who does this for my job, I can tell you that sometimes that is the make or break moment for a game for me. If I can watch your 3-minute video, which, some guy from your company, whatever, just saying, here's how you set up the board, here's your cards, here's how the turn works, have fun, that can be so much more accessible and less intimidating than saying, okay, now you have to read this 50-page instruction manual. There's also another guide for if you want to do the quick start, and then also if you want to do the bonus action, here's another book. It can get really overwhelming really quickly. And so streamlining that process and saying, okay, what is the easiest way to communicate what we need to do will be very useful.
Another thing, a lot of neurodivergent people struggle with emotional regulation, which means basically we have a hard time either showing or not showing emotions, regulating how we express emotions. So if you're developing a game, think about, is this game going to frustrate the living hell out of my players? If so, how much? Are there going to be breaks involved? Maybe you bolt it down to the table so people can't flip it over. Those are all the things, it's an important thing to consider how you're going to handle. Because, I enjoy the first 25 minutes of Monopoly quite a bit, and then after that is when you start to lose friendships and whatnot. So considering how is this game going to make my players feel, and is this game going to be playable for somebody who has trouble regulating their emotions?
And that is not to say that there's anything wrong with marketing an extremely frustrating or entirely combative game. That is okay. But it's if you market a game that is for being really, really nice to each other, and it's a team building game and we're all supposed to get along, but then you have a card that just murks everybody else at the table, that can be really challenging for somebody who's all right, but I came to this game to have a good time, to team build, to be nice to people, and now you have put me in a situation where I have to be unkind, or someone is being unkind to me. And especially for many neurodivergent people who live with all or nothing thinking, and then sometimes very linear and very sort of ADHD, mind blank.
Euclidean.
Yes, no. I'm going to say structured, but it's very take things at face value. That's not the right word, but that's what I've got, ADHD. That can be really challenging, right? So if there's not a moment of all right, we have to be very clear about what our goals are as a team and as a table of players. I completely lost it. My brain just went completely blank. Moving on, next one. Sometimes it happens.
It does. Another one is considering just the level of complexity. This one pretty much speaks for itself, but does it have to be so complex? I've designed probably 10 games, none of them published, they're not that good, but like in a notebook somewhere there are games. And it feels very compelling to want to add more layers of complexity to a game because it sort of makes it more vivid in our minds, but that's not always the case. So asking, does this component really need to be there? Perhaps the answer is yes, and that's just fine. But sort of, what is it, Chekhov's gunning it. If it's there, it should matter. It shouldn't be there for no reason. That's a very important thing to consider. But I believe it is that time.
It is. It's the to the minute.
To the minute. We really.
To the minute.
Did we include it? Nope. I'm just gonna put this one back up. There we go. So again, that is who we are. I'm HeyGude, this is Catieosaurus. But really, we could talk all day about this kind of stuff, but we really want to know what you all want to talk about. We find that people generally come to these things because they're designing a game or they're having trouble playing a game with some of their neurodivergent friends, and they have topics that they want to discuss. So we're going to go ahead and open the floor for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, there's a mic up here, or honestly, if you are loud enough, you can just sit in the chair, that's fine too. But use the mic, sorry, I'll use the mic, that'll do it.
And if you don't have any questions, but you want to help us kill 2 minutes, feel free to come on up and just tell us about your day.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right?
My name is Liz. I use she, her pronouns.
Hello.
Hello.
So I run a middle school Dungeons and Dragons club.
Nice.
In middle school minds, they're scary enough on their own. But we have a lot of players with ADHD who are neurodivergent, and one of their biggest issues is in combat, sitting, waiting for their turn. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations?
Yes, I do, Liz. I do.
Okay.
I do, Liz.
Please.
I'm sorry. So one of my favorite things that a DM has ever done for me is I played with a guy who knew very much that I had the same problem. I get so bored during combat, and it's awful. But at the time, I was playing a rogue, and he brought a lock-picking kit to the table. And he said, and at some point during the campaign before combat started, he's like, you find this box and it's locked, but you feel like there might be something valuable in it, so like, whatever. And he literally gave me a lock to pick, like a lock-picking kit game, and sat me there at the table. And so as combat was going on, my rogue is sitting, but me, Kate, was sitting there at the table, picking a lock, and I was like, this is the raddest thing to ever happen to D&D. But you can do that. Like, there's so many different ways, and it doesn't just have to be, you know, like one thing. It can be puzzles, it can be anagrams, it can be damn crosswords if you want, you know? It can be anything that can be used to highlight a character, or not even a character, a player's strengths. And say, okay, you're really good at, you know, word scrambles. Oh, looks like the goblins left a book of spells, you know? So many different options, but it's a great way to keep, especially kids, feeling like they're contributing, feeling like they're part of the team, part of the party, but then they get that individual sense of accomplishment, and it kills like a ton of time during combat.
Yeah.
Answer.
I also want to point out that, that was fantastic. But I also want to point out that what the person is doing, what the player is doing, it doesn't have to be related to the game. It could be, that's awesome. But it doesn't have to be. You could just throw some Legos down. For me, it's just having something, you know. So that could also help too. Just perhaps it doesn't have to be a brilliant, amazing thing, although it could be. But it could also be something as simple as
Legos,
a pile of paper clips,
snacks.
You know, snacks.
Lego Club is on Tuesdays, we're on Monday.
Time to join the teams to make the single coolest club in history.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. My question is very simple. I'm just wondering, is there going to be some way that we will be able to get a copy of those 10 suggestions? Because I do not have working memory.
Yes. If you go to infinitequestpodcast.com, they will definitely be there in like an hour, but don't look until then.
Thank you.
But yeah, we're actually, what I'm gonna probably do is just sort of like take these notes and turn them into like a lecture note format. But we'll have that on our like extras page on the website that you can check out. But thank you, that's a wonderful, we probably should have thought of that, honestly. Yes.
Hi there.
Hello.
I'm from an area where our gaming stores aren't exactly owned by the nicest people.
Yes.
Where just trying to deal with accessibility and even player hostility has been a severe thing, where the owner's just like, hey, look, I don't really care. Shit happens, that's that. You guys work it out. And I was wondering, do you have any sort of suggestions on how I could search out a more accessible community to either play games or play test games that I design. Like, how would I go about finding more of an open space when I'm living in a hostile gaming community?
So you're talking about your physical space, like the gaming communities in your physical...
The local gaming stores, yeah.
Gotcha.
Can't call them friendly.
My recommendation for this is a little strange and sounds simple, but Twitch, honestly, especially after the coronavirus, the first, I don't know, 10 sessions that I played of D&D was all online. Like it was weird the first couple times I played it in person. So I think Twitch is a really good place to start because you can watch what's being played, how the people interact. You can be in the chat looking, is this community toxic? Is this community accessible? You can sort of dip your toe in and be like, hey, I'm a new guy, and talk about your intentions and what you are and what you're trying to do there. And sort of test the waters. And then if it's a suitable community, I promise there will be a Discord because every Twitch streamer has a Discord. You can go in from that way, and then from there start to assemble people, because ultimately I think location doesn't matter. It's what is their ability to interact in an online setting, which by nature of being on Twitch and being active in those communities proves that they can. So and this goes for anybody, people looking for D&D groups. Twitch can be a really great resource for that. It doesn't sound obvious, it sounds kind of strange to think of it that way, but it's a really good way of finding people without overcommitting to a group that ends up being shitty. I wasn't supposed to swear.
Too late now. Every time.
But either way, I think just messing around on Twitch, trying to find some people who are doing some interesting things and meeting people through that way, because location can really screw you over sometimes.
And just really quickly, if you want to do something, in person, creating your own gaming space can honestly sometimes be the most powerful move for a community, because it's really nice to sort of be able to look at like the toxic community and say, you know what, you can stay over there. We're gonna head on over to, I don't know, Applebee's or whatever, and we're gonna meet on Tuesday nights. Because you have the power to form a community that you want to be a part of. And a lot of times what you find, if you're standing, I guess, here and asking that question, there's probably a lot of other people in your community who feel the same way. And so creating a space for them can sometimes be like super important, because you're also saying, I recognize that this is toxic and awful behavior. We're not gonna put up with that. We're all gonna go to the library on Friday nights and play someplace where, we are welcoming and inclusive. Kind of putting your money where your mouth is, you know what I mean? Yeah, but thank you for that question, it's wonderful.
Thank you so much, guys.
Of course, thank you.
Also, does anybody know how we're doing on time? I have time blindness. Cool, thank you.
Hello.
Hi, I'm writing a game for an RPG system.
Cool.
And I have a section in it, tips for GMs, and I'm wondering what sort of advice you would think would be good for telling the GMs for accessibility and that sort of thing.
Session 0. I honestly think that one of the best things that you can do is put a session 0 in your rulebook and say, part of playing my system, part of playing my game is that you are all going to sit down with the people that you want to play with, and you're going to talk about player comfort, player accessibility. What do my players need to play this game? What are your triggers that you might have? Like, what are topics that we want to avoid? How do we keep everybody safe and comfortable at the table? So much can be solved by just taking, it doesn't even have to be a long, 15-minute conversation, and just say, what do you need? How can I support you? And this is key. This is the most important part. You can have session 0s all day, but if you don't action that, so many people are nodding, right? If you don't action that, if you don't create an atmosphere in which you are going to respect and uphold those, it's less useful, right? And so frequent check-ins at the beginning of each session, remember, we're gonna all take a break in an hour, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think session 0s are an incredibly powerful tool that we are just now sort of, I think, starting to see the importance of, but that would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Of course. I'm sorry, just talking the whole time. Hello.
Hey, how are you guys?
Super good.
I am a younger brother of my older brother who is autistic, and I am also an educator, and hopefully going to be an educator on middle school and collegiate levels. And one of the things that I tend to find is a big sticking point is a lot of times just trying to make sure that what I'm talking about, whether it's to my brother or to even my students, connects with them and resonates.
Yeah.
And this is a bit of an idea mash because earlier today there was a panel on games being allowed in school for education. I thought that was fantastic, something that I want to implement. But have you guys worked with using game mechanics to help facilitate connections when you're in conversations, or you're trying to educate whether it's neurotypical or neurodivergent people on maybe complicated things, that then the game mechanics, sort of like having a lockpick for your character, to just ground it in reality and make it more real? Is there anything about that that you guys have used before that might be like a torch out in the light that maybe others can follow like me?
Well, I remember, so I was, my background is in LARPing. I've been LARPing for longer than I've been doing any other kind of gaming. Started as like a player and then eventually became a counselor, improv teacher, whatever we called it. It wasn't counselor, it doesn't matter. I started teaching. And we had a lot of neurodivergent kids because we sort of became known as a place where you can bring your neurodivergent kids and it's fine. Like they'll be accepted, it's all great. And a lot of times we would try to talk to them about real world. No, I didn't realize that we did this at the time, but I'm really grateful for your question because now I'm sort of parsing through it. But a lot of times when we needed to communicate something that was perhaps socially difficult for them to understand, we would frame it as, well, imagine if you're in game. Mm-hmm. Imagine if you're in game and you need to get along with, you're put on a quest with another player who you don't get along with. Like your characters don't get along, but you have to rescue the princess. Our campaigns were better than that, but let's just try. You had to rescue the princess who was definitely in that castle, I promise. She wasn't. But what would you do? And they would say, well, the princess is the most important thing. We would have to get along. And say, well, that's just like real life. Sometimes you're with people that you don't necessarily get along with, but you have a common goal together, which is to have a good day, be happy. And that's ultimately what you're working towards with other people. So I did find that to be very useful. Trying to figure out an in-game situation that mirrors a real-world situation that a person who might have social difficulties or difficulties understanding social cues, those analogous in-game situations can help them sort of plug it in. So anyways, the answer, yes, I have found immense use for that.
Yeah, you've had success, it sounds like, so that's great. I'll give it my best shot.
Yeah, absolutely. Real quick, sorry, this isn't just to get a second applause, but also thinking about stats. You can explain things in stats really helps. Like, oh, he has a really high charisma score. It's like, oh, he's gonna talk a lot or something like that, that can help when you get to. Anyways, so sorry.
Hello. So I have a question kind of from the other side of the table. I play, but I also DM sometimes, and I deal with chronic migraines that cause really severe brain fog. So sometimes my campaigns might go like weeks, or right now I've been on like months hiatus from like my own campaign. So I guess like suggestions for a DM struggling with their own disability, trying to run consistent sessions for their party, or keeping up momentum when maybe you've got really bad flare-ups going on and you have to wait a long time to play.
Yeah, great question. Also, literally have a migraine right now. Like, I see you.
Yeah.
I just been like, yeah, this is
All the
so
time.
great. You guys, gaming is awesome. But so one of the things that that has really helped me, because I'm also in the same boat. I deal with a lot of chronic pain. Sometimes I have to miss games and that kind of thing. I think there's sort of like two ways of handling it. The first one sounds really trite, but I'm gonna say it anyway. It is finding people who understand and support you in that. And even players who may not even want a regular weekly game. Like some players only really do want, you're like, once a month, we'll play some D&D, it'll be great. So forming a table around people who are already just like accepting and supporting can be obviously pretty useful. But if you find yourself in a game with people who are maybe less than supportive or looking for ways to support but don't necessarily know how yet, sometimes integrating those breaks into the game can be really useful. A really popular strategy that I'm obsessed with because I'm a nerd, is the DM will give their players like weekly digests, like newspaper articles. Sometimes they'll start like a separate Twitter account for the bad guy, and the bad guy will keep them abreast of his actions like via Twitter. And you can have a Discord server, like you can have anything. And so like having ways to like, just like a tweet is 140 characters or whatever it is now, right? That's so much simpler than having to run an entire campaign. But sometimes like that simple little note or the little message or the little email or whatever it might be, that can be really useful for keeping your players engaged and like, all right, and I'm so excited for the next session, the next time we get to play, because now we all have this like secret Twitter information or whatever. You know, something like that, like, and it can be anything. It can be cards in the mail or postcards, or there's a billion trillion ways to do it, but just finding ways to integrate the story in ways that like deal out a little bit of information at a time, super handy.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I want to clap for like all the questions.
Hi, my question is for design, whether or not it's like game rules or an adventure, but how do you balance providing agency and options with getting totally overwhelmed with said options? You know, bajillion feats, bajillion spells, bajillion magic items. How do you navigate that?
Do you mean as a player or as like building
as a designer,
a game? Okay.
Or a DM?
As a designer.
I think I have an instant answer.
Oh, sure, please.
I think a really good way of introducing, you know, if you want to have ultimately build up to your player having, you know, 40 spell slots, is to have a level 1, you know, have a place where they start. Because every game, it doesn't matter what it is, has a learning curve. And so a really effective way is to say, you're never going to start out with 40. You're not going to start out with 100 different abilities or whatever. You get 2. And then level 2 comes along and you get 3, you know, and you can build incrementally and you can build slowly. And that also really helps with a ton of other problems. Because as your players are learning the game, they're also learning about their characters, they're learning the mechanics, they don't have to memorize all of that at once. It saves you as a developer time from like, okay, level 1, they have to have 40 different things, right? It gives everybody involved in like every aspect of the process a real opportunity to say, okay, we're gonna start slow. We're gonna have 1 thing, now you have 2, now you have 3. And capping it even, you know, you can decide, it's your game. If you want to say you only get 5 spells, choose wisely. Sometimes that generates more creativity and more interesting gameplay dynamics than 400 spells. Because if you only have 3 to choose from, that can be fun, right?
Also, if you are married to the idea of having a bunch of different spells, perhaps having some that you obviously wouldn't use in a certain scenario. So for example, if you have a fire spell, if you have a fire spell that does a certain amount of damage but doesn't at all affect fire-based things like tieflings or something like that, make it so that there can be a lot, but most of them have no application whatsoever in this thing. So you can still have a large variety of spells that all do certain cool things, but at any given time, the player isn't choosing between all 100 of them, they're choosing between the 10 that actually might do something in this situation. So that way you can still have that variety while not just weighing down the player with choice.
Yeah, you're welcome. That's an amazing question. Thank you. Thank you, 10.
What are some more, sorry.
Oh, I'm
No,
sorry.
you're fine. Go for it.
What are some more tips around designing around emotional dysregulation? Because that's beyond making your game solo or co-op. I'm not creative enough to think of any ways to do that.
Oh yeah.
Oh, please.
Yeah, I think it really depends because like there's also no rule that says you have to. Just something to consider, you know. How frustrating are you going to make your game? How hard of a learning curve are you going to make your game? But the other thing to keep in mind is that at a certain point, like you send the game to the game store, it is now out of your hands. We've all played with sore losers. Like we've all played with that one person who's just insufferable to play games with. And that's not your responsibility. But I think setting your players up for success in terms of saying, okay, this is a game that is specifically designed for teamwork. There are not going to be opportunities for like ruining somebody's entire game experience. Or this is a game about sabotage and backstabbing and whatever. Like I won't play Munchkin. I know Munchkin is a hugely popular game. It's like, I'm not joking. I cannot emotionally handle that game. I get so upset, I get my and I'm 33 years old, like I'm a grown-ass adult, and I'm still like, he hurt my feelings. And it's really embarrassing to admit, but like, it is healthier for me not to play that game. And so I think being upfront and just saying, this is a game about backstabbing, or this is a game about kindness, like, you know, kitten, unicorn, rainbow cards are very different than like stab them in the back cards. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's very, I completely agree. I think it's not necessarily that you have to protect everybody at all times from an emotional situation in your game. It's more so making sure that the player knows what they're getting into by playing. So saying, warning, this game is super frustrating. You know, don't do this don't do this in a hotel room when you can't leave, because you're going to hate the people in the room. You know, just make sure that you're clear about what is going to happen.
And for me, honestly, I think it's maybe a really heavy-handed way of saying it, but it's about consent.
Yeah.
If I consent to playing a game about backstabbing and screwing everybody else over, okay, cool, like we all know what we're getting into. But if I don't, if I just want to have a good time with my friends, like it can be really hard to like step away from that game and feel good about what happened. And I think playing games is about having fun, but it's the fun that you want to have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's
Cool.
interesting.
Awesome question. Thank you so much. Also, I think these are going to be our last three because we're almost out of. This is you all again.
That's fine. My name's Tom. I run a game named Games Unbound. Or run a company named Games Unbound. We run games for middle schoolers. And one of my concerns that you actually brought up here is if a kid has mobility issues, specifically when it comes to manipulating objects and things like that, and you mentioned that you yourself dealt with that. I was curious what you've done to kind of help yourself out.
Well, I mean, part of it is that my disability involves knowing how to work my body, and so like I have like weird ways that I like move cards and stuff. I also retired from being a magician, so there's that. I read minds, it's fine. You just don't have to hold cards. But a lot of it has to do with, I think, the specific game. Like, that's like a very broad question.
I'll drill down a little bit more.
Okay.
Dice.
Dice.
If your hands aren't obeying you at the moment, how do you roll dice for something like D&D?
Dice Tower or digital. Like, it's really easy for me to just go boop, you know, on the phone or whatever. So like digital dice are an option, large size dice are an option. Like we have like a giant inflatable D20. And like we've not ever used it in a game, but like for a kid especially, like you get to roll this like huge giant D20. Like that's fun for everybody, you know, and it's huge. It's like foam, like oversized foam dice that they can, you know, maybe pick up like with both hands. But I just think like staying away from like really small, like trickety, fidgety objects, like I think that can be really useful. Also, honestly, just having like a designated dice roller. Like I don't need to roll my own dice. Some kids might be like, it's my turn, I want to roll. But having like a, you know, volunteer hands or something, like that can also be really useful. Gives the party something to do together. But yeah, there's a ton of different ways. You know, you can even make it about like throwing something into a basket, you know, if it's easier for them to throw rather than roll, you know, that kind of thing. Lots of different options. Okay. Mostly fun, giant, oversized stuff. That's what I'm advocating for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm new and bad at cons, so I didn't even know you guys were going to be running this panel, and I'm a huge fan, so...
It's all right.
Well, thank you very much.
But something, and this kind of starts as a suggestion to some of the other questions, but also ends with a question. I'm running a really big sandboxy game with like a lot of loose ends for a lot of new players, and they have asked that of me. But I started, I gave them all these binders for their character sheets, and there's a little color-coded infographic of like actions versus bonus actions. And then as they gain abilities and things, I try to give them printouts that are also color-coded for those. And then there's also a little slot where they can start lining up their actions when it's not their turn. So they have something to do, and it's really physical, and sometimes they get fidgety, and then it's like, oh shit, it's my turn, excuse me.
You had a color-coded infographic.
I know, I was like, my stage manager heart is so happy.
So they fidget with the things, and then sometimes they have a creative turn, but I'm worried that as we expand and the world gets bigger, they're just gonna have way too many options, and then I don't have anybody that struggles with more motor functional things, but that's very dependent on that. And do you have any sort of suggestions for avoiding that getting too big, or being something a little more nuanced for others who, because I can't quite empathize with that.
Well, so for one, this is a problem that you're anticipating, correct?
Yeah.
This hasn't happened
It
yet.
hasn't hit me yet, and I can probably get creative when it happens, but I know when they're level, 10, and they have like a whole...
How long do you think it'll take them to reach level 10?
Oh, months.
Months. So you'll have time to sort of see how things start to work out. So for one, my first piece of advice would be, wait. You don't need to solve every problem before it happens. In the immortal words of Captain America, every time somebody tries to end a war before it starts, innocent people get hurt. I'm not saying innocent people will get hurt, I just love quoting Captain America. So I would, for one, say you have plenty of time. It's okay, don't worry about it. You're clearly crushing the game already. I mean, do you want to do a panel with us next time?
I
want
to do what you guys do. I'm just figuring out all this stuff for myself. So.
But I mean, but seriously, like they can set up their moves when it's not their turn.
Yeah, they have a page that has like pockets, they're color coded.
Oh, like you're clearly crushing it. I have no doubt that you're going to be able to solve any problem that comes up.
I appreciate that.
But what I would say is don't get super bogged down in problems that haven't happened yet, because perhaps none of them get overwhelmed. Perhaps that doesn't become a thing. I mean, sure, you can think of it and something like that, but
the
you have plenty of
situation
fun.
with the spells too, that seems to help too. So maybe they'll have like their iconic moves that they have the cards for,
There you
or like
go.
an item that has a card, but other than that, they might not need it.
Yeah, exactly. Like having your core moves, your core spells that you can do at any given time, the ones that you're just mashing, like crushing people. But then also having moves that are only really useful in specific situations. If you could cast, below Homora on a chair, you would, anyway. All right.
I love that. I want to keep talking about this forever, but we have one last question and like 2 minutes left, so like let's go. Hello, your shirt is very cool.
Thank you. So a question about balancing, especially needs for different players at the same table, when that's kind of the table you can put together. With role-playing heavy or like storytelling heavy games, I find there's often a need for like a hour of buffer before everyone's like fully present at the table, and for them to really dive into the story. So how do you balance that with the desire and need for breaks, especially with differing needs at the same table?
Start game night half an hour earlier. Like, I'm not joking. Like, it is okay to like put in a buffer, right? And then in terms of like coming back to the story, like sometimes a really powerful tool is to like just like stop in media res and say like, okay, he's approaching you, but now it's time for a commercial break. Like, you know what I mean? Like just doing that, and then that way like the engagement of that, of like, oh gosh, what's gonna happen? We gotta come back, we're gonna go take a break, but I'm super excited. Finding like moments of like stakes in when to stop is something that you're doing it right if everybody goes at the end, right? But yeah, buffers are fine. Needing a little bit of time to get your head on straight. Lord knows we need that whenever we do these panels.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But
yeah, and having many different ways to absorb the same pieces of information. So perhaps while everybody's still chatting, taking their seats, you have a cheat sheet of whatever information just on the table. So if one of the players goes, they can do that. So having many different ways about accessing the same piece of information is a very useful strategy for that.
yeah, great question though.
Fantastic.
We do have to end, but before we do, we just want to let you know where to find us. Eric?
Yeah, again, my name is Eric Gude. I go by HeyGude on all the things. I'm the co-host of Katie and Eric's
Infinite Quest.
You can find us anywhere podcasts are available. We talk about adult life with ADHD and navigating the world as neurodivergent adults.
And I'm Kate Osborne, and I'm Catieosaurus on all the social medias. We both have Twitch. It's HeyGude and Catieosaurus.
Oh yeah, we do live streams every day.
We do live streams every day, pretty much, when we're not at conventions. But thank you all so much. We are going to be hanging out in the lobby for a little bit. I'm genuinely not feeling super well, so we might not be there for very long, but if you want to come say hi, we'd love to meet you. But honestly, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much for supporting these conversations in our community. And if you liked this, feel free to let Max know. If you didn't, don't let them know. Thank you all so much.